Yeah.
Hello, hello.
I can check my
You
hair.
can check your hair, looks gorgeous.
It's like they got me all freaked out about the side part, which is the middle part. I know they're really. The middle part is actually not flattering.
Which
I
part?
tried it. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, just know you're good. It's fine. Yeah. Oh, sorry. I should keep an eye on that time anyway, so that I can, you're gonna manage.
So yeah, 1 minute. I mean, class ends at 12:30. I think we'll just turn it into a dialogue. We'll do mostly dialogue. Feel free to get your
That's great. Okay.
Got really into it this morning, and so the questions are hard, so I'm prepped to be like, and a lot of this, a lot of them are doing research about this, so doing research, you know. I'm gonna go to the tank top. This is too hot.
I know. I was like, it was under the.
All right, shall we get started? Okay. Do you want, I mean,
This is just going into the computer, right?
no, this is gonna amplify there, because let's turn it on, hit the mute button.
And I can turn it to a posture. Wonderful. Hi, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. For those of you joining us on Zoom, this is part of CASA Pitzer. CASA is critical advocacy and critical action and social advocacy. I forgot my own center's name. Which is a center for community-based research and community organizing collaboration out here in Ontario. We are an academic program in Pitzer, and we are here today with our students and our most esteemed and illustrious friend and guest speaker, Safiya U. I'm gonna hand it. Paula, do you want to say anything, or Safiya also said she could introduce herself?
Yeah. I'll just say, we were really discussing the first chapter of your book and how this connects to the work that folks here are doing, and just so happy to have you here. Sharing this really, really important work. And so yeah, go ahead and introduce yourself and we'll dive right in.
Okay, great. All right.
Oh wait, you don't need that.
Do I need this?
Just bring that closer to you.
Can you hear me okay this way? I don't know. It's so strange being inside with a mask trying to teach and make connections with everyone, because I need the whole face and you need my whole face to really know where I'm coming from. But I'm really pleased to meet you. I'm Safiya U, and I'm an associate professor of gender studies and African American studies at UCLA. I also hold a research associate position at the Oxford Internet Institute at the University of Oxford in the UK. And which is, by the way, is not in London. Everyone thinks that it is actually in Oxford, which is an hour and a half from London. And I run, I co-direct and co-founded the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry, which is a research center focused on, I guess the shortest answer that I would say at a cocktail party is, we study the dark side of the internet, or kind of the worst dimensions of the internet on society and on people who are vulnerable to harms by the internet. So a lot of different kinds of people. So there are plenty of people who study the internet and what's possible, yay. And we study what's also possible in terms of harm, which we have considered to be kind of largely an understudied area that needs a lot more attention. Of course, we know that here in the United States now, because we've seen the role of the internet in fostering anti-vax, anti-science, anti-democratic, anti-civil rights, anti-human rights kinds of abuses over the last decade. So those are the kinds of things that we study at UCLA, and I invite you, if you're ever at UCLA when we're gathering again, we actually don't even have our space. It's about the size of this table, but you're welcome to visit us when we're on campus again. We're kind of still not fully on campus. So let me just say a little bit about this work and how this book kind of came into existence. About a decade ago, well, I spent my first career in advertising and marketing. I grew up in Fresno, so I'm a native Californian, but I lived in Oakland in the Bay Area. I worked in advertising. I worked for big companies, small companies, nonprofits in the Bay Area. I always kind of worked on these issues that were at the intersection of kind of like social good and companies or corporations, what they were doing, getting like, I guess, an entree into those conversations in that world by working at a small nonprofit called Business for Social Responsibility. And this was in the 90s when companies like Liz Claiborne and Nike and Reebok were getting in massive amounts of trouble for having children work on making their products in sweatshops, right? So this is like before probably most of you were even born. Companies have always been grappling with these issues around kind of the way in which they do business and their effects on society, and especially the way in which they extract from or exploit vulnerable people and communities around the world where they either manufacture or source or sell their products. So I was kind of oriented really when I was about your age, most of you, to these conversations. Like when I was, let's say, traditionally aged undergraduate in my early 20s, mid 20s. And so when I finally went to start grad school, so many years later, I've been working in industry and I had been always kind of thinking about these issues. I was so surprised to see how people in academia were talking about the tech sector. And of course, I had lived in Oakland through the first .com boom and bust. So, all my friends had been evicted from their apartments so that you could jack up the rents 3 times, for some tech workers. And that had happened to me and my friends. And we were really aware of how the Bay was changing in these ways that we didn't love. Oakland in particular had been a place that was so vibrant and full of African-American life and culture and energy and festivals and gatherings. And we started to see in the 90s, as we were young people in our 20s, how much the Bay was changing from tech. And of course, if you go to the Bay Area now, it's as terrible as you could imagine in terms of the profound inequality. Truly people tearing down small homes, building mansions, and then an encampment of people experiencing homelessness, a block away, which is not really unlike LA where I live. So those kinds of real life touch points were there for me. And then I go to graduate school in the middle of the cornfields in Champaign, Illinois, Champaign-Urbana. Okay, so like many California kids, I was like, what is Illinois? I was like, I don't even know, what is that? Seriously, other than Chicago and Northwestern and maybe the University of Chicago, I had no idea. I was like, they have big schools in Illinois, so ignorant. Truly, I just had no idea that there are these big land grant universities. I think a lot of us who grew up in California, we're not really attuned to these University of Michigan, the Big Ten, unless you're a hardcore football fan or something. You're really not tracking for these schools like Illinois and Indiana and Michigan. And so, I when I got married and I moved to Champaign-Urbana, really not to go to school, but because that's where our family was, I decided to go back to graduate school at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And here I am in the middle of this country where people are really not touched in the same way by the kinds of rapid social transformations that happen on the coast. So they were really not as attuned to like what was happening in the Bay Area, the Silicon Valley. It was more like a thing you watched on television, but it wasn't a thing that you necessarily felt up close and personal. And I was surprised at how I came to learn how Illinois was so profoundly implicated, the university, in like, maybe implicated is too harsh a word, but it was like a ground zero for the internet, for the making of the internet, right? Mosaic, which was the first web browser, was developed at the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, which is at the University of Illinois. The U of I is a direct pipeline to Silicon Valley. It's a top 5 computer science school. So if you're computer science, you know about Illinois. Many graduates of Illinois had like me, like Max Levchin, the founder of PayPal, and Steve Chen, who was a co-founder of YouTube. I mean, all these guys went to Illinois. And then Mark Andreessen, obviously, who eventually started the company Netscape when he was a graduate student and worked on Mosaic, which again was his first web browser. So there was this strong like computing culture at Illinois, and as I was going back to graduate school there, I was kind of interested in their take on tech, which was again really different than like me and my friends getting evicted from our house because of escalating housing prices, which is completely removed from like gentrification, which is what happens when big tech companies come to your town. So it was, I'm giving you like the background. None of this is in the book, right? This is just like a context for like, how does a book like this show up? And as I was in graduate school, I started in the information school, kind of started and ended. I was surprised at the way in which people were kind of narrating Google. Now, part of the reason is because obviously, if some of your co-founders of the founders of some of the big tech companies come from that university, we got a pretty positive spin on the internet and Silicon Valley. Okay, so no one's trying to mess up what the future donors might do for the university. Which makes me a terribly unpopular alum, so I'll tell you that. Okay, so that's happening, and everyone's really not willing to kind of look critically necessarily in specific ways at different kinds of projects that are happening in Silicon Valley. And I was really fortunate that I got to take classes with communication scholars in the Institute for Communications Research at Illinois. And these were people who were early internet scholars too. People like Lisa Nakamura, who wrote a very famous book called Cybertypes, and had been writing since the 90s about racism on the internet. Some of these things are not relevant because you didn't experience, or you may not have experienced fully that kind of early internet of the early 90s. But there were people who were kind of thinking quickly, and I gravitated just like a moth to light to those people because I felt like they were speaking a language that was more resonant with what my own experience was with living in the Bay, and of course also working in industry and seeing the high degree to which we were invested in spending all this money on manipulating search results. It's like the early days of SEO. When only media buyers and people who worked in advertising companies really understood like media placement and like buying keywords and paying the most for keywords to optimize content. And this is why for many years, even to this day, when you like did certain kinds of searches, you got giant corporations were like dominated the page, and like JCPenney years ago got in trouble for this because they had figured out how to game Google's algorithms so that when you search on dresses, you always got JCPenney's first, which I thought was kind of hilarious because I didn't know anybody still shopped at JCPenney's. I haven't seen a JCPenney's in so long. Right. I was like, oh, are they still in business? So, the early days of that, Google, even in their kind of original paper, Anatomy of a Hypertextual Search Engine, were trying to figure out what they would do about the gamification of search. And you know, as you get into the book, it's boring. It's only really interesting to people who are kind of technically, I guess, oriented, or people who are librarians, or people who work around information knowledge management. But this whole idea of what gets kept, what gets discarded, what's made visible, what is made invisible, what is searchable and findable. As Helen Niesenbaum says, a scholar from NYU and Cornell, to be is basically like to not be indexed by the web is to not be known, like to not exist. So that if you don't appear in a search engine, do you even exist, or does a thing exist? And the way in which the world is like being remade by something like search engines is so profound. And this was happening while I was in graduate school. And so that's the kind of important backstory that I think is, I want you to know, because I think also you have amazing ideas already right now. You're seeing things, and I want you to know that when I was not that much older than you know in graduate school, seeing things like, wow, it's really interesting. Every time you do searches on any kind of girl or woman of color, you get super racist and sexist results. Like, everybody says that what happens in a search engine is just like what you get is just what's most popular. But how's that going to work for people who are not in the majority of the population, like children, or like getting even more specific, girls of color by different ethnicities? As soon as you start categorizing people by their sexual identity, their religious identity, their ethnic identity, you become a very small sliver of the population relative to the whole. So how will any minoritized group of any sort ever be able to be fairly represented in these spaces if it's a majority rules situation? So it's like, we gotta spend some time figuring out what's going on there, because that doesn't quite make sense to me, that that's the full logic. And of course, I knew from having been in advertising, again, like I said, that all the media buyers were buying up all the keywords to get certain kinds of things seen. And those of us who didn't have the money, how are they gonna compete with JCPenney's, the JCPenney's of the world? That didn't make sense to me either. So this book was an exploration, and it was a research endeavor to try to unpack these kind of mythologies about what search engines are. But also, I think the kind of bigger project was to say, okay, look, here's all these terrible examples of what happens. What does it mean that, I know not this group, but students in the United States write their papers out of Google? Like, truly Google everything to jump off into their research. Or the kids all over the country, their teachers are telling them, I don't know, just Google it. Or their parents are like, just Google it. What's that gonna do? If everyone thinks that what we're working with here is just like a neutral, objective, credible arbiter, what happens when that fails? And what happens when we look up in 50 years and we have school that's even more not like unaffordable, more public schools that are broken, and more people who are vulnerable to only having a search engine just to kind of figure out the information environment. So that's really, like, I think important. And I will just say that you have ideas, I cut myself off there, but you have ideas too of things that you're seeing. And I know because I see all the time, like last year, I was, you know, people in their 20s and in their 30s who were seeing things like how shadow banning was happening on Instagram, right? Or on TikTok. And were organizing and responding to it online. So my encouragement as we start this conversation today is to think about what are things that you see that seem like, seems like something's happening there, even though there aren't books written about it yet, right? Because when I wrote this book, and I wrote, really when I wrote the dissertation, it was very hard to get people to get on board. Everybody was like, no. Algorithms cannot discriminate because algorithms are just math, and math can't be racist or sexist. Math has no values. Now we have multiple congressional hearings. We have whistleblowers, we have ex-employees, we have all kinds of people coming out who are like, we programmed the algorithm to manipulate the public. We programmed the algorithm. We knew it was causing depression for girls, or driving them into mental health crises, but we let it stand anyway. Like, we know now, we have like the latest whistleblower, Frances Hagen, obviously coming forward with her 10,000 documents and evidence to show that companies like Facebook were actively manipulating their technology in ways that were harmful. We have Maria Reza, who just Filipina, who just won the Nobel Peace Prize, who took on the government in the Philippines to resist human rights abuses and the way in which the internet was being manipulated there. So we have lots of people now with lots of evidence of the harm, the way in which big technological systems and large are manipulated and manipulate and hold lots of values. And at the time that I was writing this, we didn't have those kind of books making those kinds of claims, but now we have more. And so I think it's like, it's worth maybe opening up the conversation to say, like, now that the landscape has changed and we can have these conversations so much more easily, and you see the things you see, what are the things that you see that you think are interesting or important? I won't put the pressure on you to say that you might write the next book about, but I will also say that, you know, it could be interesting for your own research or for your own journey here. So what kinds of things are you working on? What are things that you notice about technology that are resonant kind of in the context of this conversation? Yeah. And then I'm gonna let you all do.
No, I'm just letting the Zoom folks know that. Yeah.
Sorry.
Like explosion of like internet activism that we've seen like over the last few years or so. And like I remember during the summer of 2020, like Sarah too about, you know, like reposting things on Instagram, that sort of like activism. But I noticed that when I would try to share things, a lot of the time there would be like an action blocked message, and it just simply wouldn't let me. And I started like screenshotting that and like putting it in a folder of like photos of like, what the hell was happening? And so I don't know, I'm thinking about the ways that like algorithms can use to, I guess, censor is a word, or just really like filter out what's allowed to circulate. And I think this has a lot to do with the kinds of things you're talking about. What I mean, I only read the first chapter, so the book, but
Most of the good stuff. So you're good.
yeah. So I don't know if you have comments on that, or this doesn't necessarily have to be a question.
What were the kinds of things? Do you feel comfortable sharing? What kinds of things you were sharing that were getting blocked?
Yeah, I don't remember super specifically, but I know that they had to do with the Black Lives Matter protests, different like action movements.
Yeah, a lot of people have documented the way in which Black Lives Matter, defund the police, even predating that by 15 years, Occupy, when the Occupy movement was happening. So kind of politically left, let's say, types of content really being banned. Even my own things have been, that I have posted, have been taken down, which is hilarious. I mean, you should see people go crazy when that happens. They're like, it's an algorithm of oppression. You know, they go like they really use it. It's funny when that happens, mostly on Instagram. But yeah, I mean, that, you know, of course, that being a Facebook product. And of course, one of the things that people have noticed so much, of course, all these tech companies are different, their leadership and their orientation in the world is different too. But certainly Facebook and its products have been very implicated in both kind of shadow banning and blocking and also amplifying and kind of hyper promoting and organizing right-wing content around the world, not just in the United States.
And the like lack of like addressing that directly like shocks me. It seems so well, like so obvious.
Yes.
And, like there's so much evidence like pointing to that, what you just described. And like it's shocking to me like how nobody seems to be able to or want to like directly confront them on that, like how they can see it.
Yeah. Okay, so let's keep that conversation going about like what does it take to even think about or confront what's happening still.
Oh, I was just gonna say. Sorry, this is
No, it's
Yeah,
good, it's good.
perfect, it's good.
Okay. Like what Tess was saying, but a little bit different. Like I would be reposting similar stuff to my story, and none of mine ever got blocked. But if I post, I have like 1,500 or something followers on Instagram, and I post a picture of my dog or something like that on my story, I'll get like 500, 600 views. And if I repost something that's like about that, I usually get 100. So it's like Instagram is like prioritizing my story for like 6 times more if it's a picture of my dog versus if it's reposting something about kind of social justice or organizing or whatever. And so it's not as terrible as what she was saying, but I just think that's really interesting.
Yeah, you know, that reminds me of, I gave a talk a couple of years ago, maybe right around the beginning of COVID, and I met a woman who is one of the co-founders of the Feminist Center for Creative Work. It used to be called the Women's Center for Creative Work in LA, and just changed it to Feminist. And her name is Mandy, and she posts a lot of like body positive kind of messages on her Instagram. She's an African-American woman, Black woman. And she said, I remember her having this campaign on Instagram where she would talk about how like if she took photos of herself where the lighting or used filters to kind of like lighten and she looked lighter, all the lights, and whenever like she looked darker skinned, tank. Same with if she was wearing like her bathing suit, you know, or if she was wearing a turtleneck, you know, and so she had kind of like this, her own commentary in her Instagram about like, you know, give me the likes even when I look dark skinned, right? Give me the likes even when I have my clothes on, you know, like to really point to kind of what you're talking about, which is what is the taste making sensibility algorithmically that's happening too, that makes her more visible and also that of course our own behavior, our own interaction with different kinds of content also train the machine learning algorithms, right? So it's like there's lots of processes that are happening in training the algorithms. It's both our own behavior, so our own colorism, our own politics, right? Our own internalized white supremacy, you know, our own kind of class politics, all these kinds of things that are happening. And then there are also, of course, it's Tess, right? Tess, in your case, there's also content that gets flagged or content moderators who deem something outside the bounds of the community standards, let's say, and will also take those things down. And that also trains the algorithms in these ways. Yeah. Tell me your name too, will you all?
First off, thank you for coming. I'm Anton. So the starting quickly, so I know like a couple of my trans friends, like especially biologically female to male, if they were to post like a shirtless pic, they oftentimes they'll get flagged more for like nudity or for exposure versus like if I were to like post a picture of mine, shirtless pic of myself. So I think that's another example of the algorithm negatively enforcing transphobia online.
Yes.
And then the second one, I just have a question, maybe it's gonna be addressed later, but like, I was wondering, what can we do as individuals? And I remember like watching, I think Tesla sent us a video for one of the
Need a back, I'll get it back.
Hello?
Okay, there we go.
And like the first question that someone asked you was like, basically hinted at like, what can we do as individuals to like, or is the algorithm controllable? It's not always like individuals as like people to like fight back
Yeah.
against like
I know.
the algorithm change things.
Yeah, I love the question. Thank you for surfacing that example, because I think that's another really powerful example of like the way cultural values get like hegemonic normative values get reinscribed also over and over and over into these systems. And you know, this is an early internet issue too, where you know, websites, for example, people using computers in libraries in the early 2000s, late 90s, early 2000s, who would go to do research on things like breast cancer, would have sites shut down because the internet filter that the library was using thought they were looking for pornography, right? So we've always had, even in Web 1.0, we've had these fractures, these ruptures, this slippage, where we see how values start to get encoded. And of course, this was led by Congress, when Congress was funding community technology centers and really trying to make computing available in communities. A lot of that work in the early days they did at libraries, but Congress would not allow libraries to have computers if people were going to use them for porn, which of course the internet is for porn, is what they say on Avenue Q, right? So you'd have people who couldn't get, women in particular, who couldn't get information about breast cancer or breast health because breast was somehow a dirty word, right? That is pornographic. So like those tensions have been with us since we've been dealing with kind of the advent of the commercial web and computing and home computing. So I think, you know, the question is like, yeah, what can we do as individuals? I mean, I think this is where I draw down from scholars like Janelle Hobson, who's a Black feminist media, she's a film scholar, media film scholar. And Janelle Hobson has written extensively about depictions of Black women in Hollywood, racist depictions, sexist depictions of Black women in Hollywood. She's a critical theorist. And one of the things that she does, which I really embrace and try to use to answer this question, is she says, well, the project here for us as individuals is to see what's happening and be like, oh, I see what you're doing there. It doesn't mean you're never going to watch another movie that's made in Hollywood. That's just kind of like not likely, right? Or that you're going to withdraw from all media because it's trash. What the goal is for us to be able to go and see a film and say, I see what you're doing there. And to have a critical read on it. And it also doesn't mean that you can't enjoy it, but you can have a critique, or you can know the boundaries or the limits of what that project is. And I think that's a really helpful way to think about the internet and the platforms we engage with too, which is to be able to say, I know what's happening here. I can still say hi to grandma on Facebook, but that's who's on Facebook, right? Even though you know you don't want to be in there anymore. Or to keep loose ties, right? Which is always my struggle with Facebook and our family, because we live so far, you know, most of our families in Illinois, and all the older people are on Facebook. And I hate Facebook and really just despise it. And also, if I leave it, I know that's also doing something kind of at the micro level of the family, right? It's like I'm denying the pictures of the grandchild. But I also know the limits and where I refuse my participation in it, right? So I think it's like those critical engagements are important. The real action is, listen, all of you who are people of conscience should be thinking about, where are you gonna, starting hyper locally, where are you gonna run for student government at Pitzer and run it and demand that the administration not use AI technologies on the student body in ways that are harmful? Like, there's so many things just locally that can be done. Is your campus, are your campus police using license plate readers to look for students to jam up, right? Like, that's actually, people are arguing the constitutionality of license plate readers, right? Do you have a learning management system that tracks your every move? Are you forced to use Turnitin by the administration? Like, there's so many different projects that happen locally. Maybe you should be thinking about, like, being on the city council, being in, you know, the school boards, being in, putting yourself in positions to lead throughout the course of your life, many different, in different ways throughout the course of your life, where you can affect change. Because I will tell you that some of the most dangerous dimensions of artificial intelligence right now, like, and I think first of like facial recognition technologies, those are being banned at the local level. San Francisco, Detroit, Portland. I think Seattle has had some movement around that. So there's a lot we can do as people who live in the world to resist the shaping of and the remaking of our worlds in more dangerous ways. And that is for anything. That's for anything. That's around the environment, that's around technology, right? That's around, you know, economic inequality, that's around the price of education, who can get it, who can't. I mean, I fold these issues about algorithms and AI into a broader set of like politics and choices that you get to make, but you don't get to make choices when you like don't know, right? And so that's one of the reasons why like education is so incredibly important. Like, we can't ever give that up, because it allows us to apprehend these things that are happening. Of course, we need to vote out people who are giving carte blanche to the tech sector. Part of the reason we don't see, Tess, your question earlier, or maybe it was yours, I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. Isabel. You know, part of the reason we don't have the full level of like accountabilities is because the tech sector is the most powerful lobby group in DC.
Beyond prison guards?
Beyond prison guards, yeah. And they have a huge reach into governments around the world. And so, you know, but listen, there was a time when we were younger, that the oil industry had the most powerful lobbies, and you know, we still continue to take them on, right? Because we have to. Tobacco, pharmaceutical, you know, so we have work to do in all the places, and we do our work where we can. The thing is to not, I think the most valuable thing you can do is to not just shrug your shoulders and say, there's nothing I can do. That's probably the most dangerous thing. Yeah. Okay, Brian.
I'm just sort of curious, going off of what you said, both in regards to like AI technologies and sort of on a more local level, right? Talking to our administration, trying to get them to not use AI technologies in a bad or exploitative way. And then sort of from a more broader perspective, we were talking about earlier, in regards to like how the internet does not provide results to groups that aren't in the majority, right? That are beneficial to them or representative results that they would be looking for. And so like how on a more technical level do we shift the algorithms and start providing more just equitable tools that might not even reflect the majority in the present, right? Something I wrote down is kind of like how do we build tools for a future that doesn't yet exist? So like, what are your sort of thoughts on that from a more technical perspective?
That's a beautiful thing to write down, because I think our imaginary about the future has to be an imaginary of the most freedom, the most possibility, the most support for humanity and for the earth and its inhabitants beyond just humans. And we are living inside somebody else's imaginary. We know that, right? And many competing imaginaries. And I know this, any of us who come from families or ancestral histories, ethnic or religious histories of persecution or oppression, we know that someone imagined a different possibility and we're in it, right? So we know that. We have lots of evidence, but we also know there are terrible things that people have also imagined that we're also contending with still. So I think there are, okay, so in a realm of like search, which is, one dimension of the internet, right? It is a very important one, because most people, if they don't know where they're looking for something, anything on the internet, they go through a portal. And that portal is some type of broker, some type of information broker, and it's usually a search engine. Okay, because all they really have are some keywords to help them like shoot out into the web, right? This network of global network of computers. So how the search engine indexes and organizes those few handful of keywords, and think about that, you're looking at 2 or 3 keywords, and it's searching millions, hundreds of millions of computers and websites for those 2 or 3 little keywords, and it's deciding what's going to show up on your screen out of that. I mean, that's really extraordinary. And it's extraordinary that we would trust those first 20, you know what I mean? When there are like a million things that are possible. So that already should be suspect for us. All right. So, at the back of the book, this is spoiler alert, if you just read the conclusion, there's, I talk about like other ways we could imagine visualizing search or visualizing information retrieval, like how that could look. And I think there are some people at MIT right now who are trying to build alternative search engines. There's a great group that we work with in LA called Feminist AI. They're looking like, what would a feminist search engine look like, for example, just to experiment. I mean, these are technologists who just are experimental. I think there are some interesting artistic and experimental things happening. And every one of those we need to support, because what they do is they pull back at the edges of having one monopoly leader. Okay, so one is not ever going to be enough. It's not the answer. And that's one of the reasons why the Federal Trade Commission right now has been so aggressive, and their appointment of obviously President Biden's appointment of Lena Khan as our Federal Trade Commission chair right now is so important. She's an amazing law professor from Columbia who wrote the canonical antitrust paper on Amazon, and she's not playing games. Okay, Nobody should play. I just want a t-shirt that's like, don't play with me. So she's serious about understanding what happens when you have a monopoly leader like Amazon, like Google, like Facebook, right? In each channel that don't just dominate kind of horizontally, but they have these verticals that they also control that although she wouldn't articulate it this way, I articulate it as they control many layers of the stack. So now we're at the technical answer, okay, which you're getting at. If the monopoly is part of the problem, which we know it is, we need hundreds, thousands, we need specialized search engines. So if you're looking for specialized information, I mean, believe it or not, that's what libraries are, right? They have special collections. We have libraries that are dedicated just to one subject domain, just a science library, just an engineering library, just the humanities library, right? The African American Studies library, because that level of specialization and nuance is really, really important. Because if you're looking for those 3 words, it's going to come out of the biggest pool, not the smallest nuanced pool, right? So this is one of the reasons why we already have models in the world that have actually stood the test of time for thousands of years, called libraries. And I write in one of these chapters all about libraries as another analog model. I think the technical aspects of this, people are experimenting with. I believe we need to experiment, and Sarah Roberts, who's the co-director of the UCLA Center for Critical Internet Inquiry with me, we describe it together as decolonizing the stack. So how we think of the software layer of the Google search, right, or the Facebook, then we might go to like the platform, right, that it's kind of an enclosure that you live in, right? So that's what the platform is. But what happens when Google owns the web backbone too, okay, and stuff? And then what happens when, like in the case of Amazon, it not only owns the platform, but it also owns the web architecture, and it still can get insights from what every other smaller company is doing, because it has data from the web architecture, right, the web backbone, so it can be in a competitive, advantageous place over any competitor because it owns that layer of the stack. What happens when, in the case of Google, it owns the platform, right? Search, YouTube, all of its different product offerings. It also owns the web architectural backbone, right? We only have a handful of like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, who kind of own the infrastructure. Then it also owns all the devices that are connected. Everybody on an Android phone, now you're on that. And you know, all of your, you know, whether it's Alexa or it's what's Google's assistant? No, that's Apple. Siri's Apple's. Echo, Alexa, is it Echo? Echo, I think is Google's. Okay, so those are so many, and then Google also controls its own kind of manufacture, mining, extraction, okay, process, all the way down to the minerals that are put into the microprocessor chips to make the electronics run. So we own every level, and exploitation, I promise you, is happening at a physical level of the stack. So if you think like a technology stack in terms of internet infrastructure, there's different kinds of technology stacks. So that is important because at every layer of the stack, we argue there could be interventions to remake the consolidated power and control that's happening, right? By now, like 5 or 6 companies who dominate globally. So I think that those imaginaries are really important. There are people who are working on like Web 3.0, you know, Jack at Twitter, you know, he's always talking about the decentralized web. You know, people are thinking about blockchain, and there's lots of different ideas out here a more democratized internet. The internet most of us experience is the kind of corporate commercial internet fully. There is a whole movement, I would say I'm part of loosely, coming out of some colleagues at MIT and other places. The MacArthur Foundation and Ford Foundation have been funding what we call public interest tech. So this kind of PIT movement, public interest tech, and that movement is afoot. And that's where people are thinking about what does public infrastructure look like, taxpayer, right? More democratized, locally owned and controlled and governed. And that to me is very exciting. Of course, it also means we can't let democracy collapse, because you can't really have democratic infrastructures and possibilities if you don't have the concept conceptually of democracy viable in a society. And we are actually losing viability with that. I mean, I will tell you, it's shocking to me when I talk to students, and sometimes, you know, they're so like beautiful and innocent in the kinds of things, the questions that they'll ask. And I've had students ask me, Professor Noble, but don't you think that companies are more efficient and could run like the world better? And I'm like, that is literally a textbook definition of fascism, a textbook definition of fascism. But see, it doesn't translate like that when you're just thinking after 50 years of neoliberal economic and social policy in this country and in Europe. Like, that makes sense. Like, companies probably can do it better, but they can do it better because they've totally weakened the public sector. And so those are some of the reasons why we need to kind of think about like what the possibilities are. I think possibilities are brewing. I think your generation will also have a big say in what that could be. And I will tell you, just seeing engineering students over the last decade, from millennials to Gen Z, the way they speak in a classroom is mind-blowing. It's so amazing, because the older millennials were like, tech can't be racist. I don't want to hear it. I'll kill you. You know what I mean? They're just like, no. And I got to get my job at Google. And the Z's are like, I hate Google, and how do I get off the internet? And I don't even want a phone. And like, you know, just like, how could, like, I'm trapped, you know, they feel differently. Or how do I like really, it's like the bill has come due on the environment, on the economy, on social policy, on racism, on sexism, on all of it. And everyone's like, okay, now that the bill has come due, we're not having it, and we got to do something different. And that's incredible and amazing. And I think that is where lots of ideas are going to come from.
Can you grab the mic?
Some of what you talk, does that pertain to sort of when you talk about the vertical monopoly that companies like Google and Amazon have, essentially allowing companies to have ownership over public-facing services, but not the back-end infrastructure, whether it be like, I know there's a whole conversation around internet access, and you know, nationalizing that, and having that be a public service, as well as like, whether it be web hosting or you know, web architecture and things like that, and where is data being held? So are those sort of things that you're thinking about?
Yeah, those are things, I'm not thinking about those per se, but I think that those things are being thought about, and I think there's space for you to join into those conversations. I know NYU has been having events and meetings that you could check out, you could just go to around public interest technology. I know MIT has also been a place where Ethan Zuckerman has really been leading some of those conversations. The Knight Foundation for the last 2 days has been holding this huge conference about the internet we want, the internet of the future. And I spoke at a panel there yesterday. And You know, a lot of the same kind of players are still in some of these spaces who kind of brought us the internet that we have today, but there's still there's space for more of us who are critics that are also in those spaces. So I would say watch that Knight Foundation event, because different ideas are happening in those panels, and they're probably all be posted online, where people are trying to imagine different. I mean, even Tim Berners-Lee, who was one of the founders of like the, you know, the internet, who worked on protocols, he is also completely disheartened with the internet we have, which is this total, again, corporate captured kind of network experiment and experience. And let me just remind us, the internet we experience in the United States is not the internet everybody else experiences in other parts of the world. So we're already off, you know, and there are, I mean, I don't want to speak too broadly because I don't have the expertise in like computer science emanating out of China, but I will tell you that my colleagues who are Chinese computer scientists who work on deep internet protocols, they argue that their internet and their conceptions of the way they build web architecture is completely different than the way we do it in the United States. And part of it is because some of them work, and this is going to get really boring super fast, but I'll just say that the short of it is our conceptions of programming languages in the United States is really binary. It's based on a binary logics, and these stem from like early math wars, math arguments about statistical representation. All right, and so you can trace these back like to Aristotle, and if you study Aristotle and like his conception of the world, you know, it's like incredibly racist. I mean, just like so. No one remembers their philosophy classes, but like if you took philosophy at the end of your years in college instead of the first year, you'd see it completely differently. Like, whoa, wait a minute, what? It's like the origins of like scientific classification are extremely hierarchical, with, you know, humans at the top and then gradations, and of course all of our racial hierarchy systems emanate from that. Our gendered systems of power emanate from this, right? These kind of scientific, pseudoscientific claims about the nature, right, of humanity and human beings. And so they're very racist in their kind of conceptions early on. And we use those logics to inform our own programming binary variety of different kinds of languages. Well, there are other parts of the world where people program out of different philosophies. So that, you know, when I talk to some of them and they program out of like philosophies of Taoism and interconnectedness and multiple, let's say, stakeholders, right? And a different kind of ecology of the way in which they map the world in non-hierarchical ways. They produce different kinds of programming languages and conceptions of what technology can do and should do. Now, in the US, we only ever hear about social credit and like an AI arms race with the Chinese, which is the way that our government articulates what's happening. But I think from a learner, I think there's still so much to learn about what the possibilities are technically. And we need to imagine them with conceptions of the world that are broader than the kinds of origin stories and logics that we use in the West. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm thinking a lot about agriculture, you know, and the ways that biodiversity, right? If you look at like big agribusiness farms, right? It's like they're controlling the seeds, the soil, the chemicals, like everything in production. And we're told the story, well, this is the most efficient way to produce food. And then you see these smaller farms that are not practicing monocropping. There's biodiversity. It feels like such a parallel. And again, that we're sold this idea that there's no other way to do it because it's most productive, right? I think about Vandana Shiva's work. She talks about the monocropping of the mind. I feel like that's what we're talking about, right? The monocropping of the mind.
I love that. That's such a great and powerful, you know, analogy. And I think that's very true.
Yeah.
The other thing we also see in that movement is that the organic, slow food movement is for the rich.
Yep.
So we have to ask ourselves, like, and I think of this all the time about Google. I'm like, well, Google is actually McDonald's.
Yep.
Okay. So and the library is farm to table organic. Okay. So what is it about, like, how our worlds are also, this is what I'm saying about the other dimension, how our worlds are structured economically, geographically, physically, such that some people, all they get is McDonald's in their neighborhood. And some people get to have a house that has a garden that one of their parents stays home and helps cultivate, right? Or they have enough money, or they have a gardener, or like whatever, like that. That is really instructive for us to make these connections, because if you look at Silicon Valley executives, what do they do around the internet? Well, they have their nannies sign no-tech agreements where their nannies can't let their children be captured and put on social media. They make sure their kids don't have screen time, or they hella limit it. They have all these different rules for their own children. And they work in the companies that make the factory of the tech for the rest of us to eat, right? So those are insightful things, and we study and watch those things too. It's crazy.
You have another hand, can you pass the mic?
Thank you so much for your work as a Gen Xer. This is very helpful.
Got you.
So I'm new to academia. I've been in it for about 6 years. It's my sixth year just learning how to use a library. No joke, never used it in my life, except for elements, Black and Asians. And when you're talking about the information available, looking at what is in the public libraries compared to the academic libraries, it's
Night and day.
yeah. And I'm thinking about the whole thing with Aaron Schwartz and JSTOR like several years ago.
Yes.
Wouldn't that be like a huge thing for the public libraries to have the same sources available
Yes.
at the college level? And why isn't that happening?
Yes. So that's a great question, and it's one that gets posed to the field all the time, which is that, we have different kinds of librarianship and archives and museums and all of these different types of spaces that collect, organize, curate knowledge. And one of the biggest challenges, I think, for public libraries is that they're funded municipally. For the most part, they do get some federal and state funding, but they're really managed so that if you go to the public library in Pasadena, it's totally different than the library in West Adams where I live, right, in LA, or in Crenshaw. So this uneven investment in public libraries all over the country is part of the challenge. So if you live in a hyper-resourced area, typically, which has come at the expense of some other area, that you're going to have uneven collection development and availability. Now you add to that university libraries, which typically have been historically the spaces for researchers. So they have much greater budgets. Faculty most faculty can't be researchers without access to high quality and a lot of knowledge. So universities have invested in this country hundreds of years in the academic libraries, long before there was the public library movement. I mean, in the beginning of this country, we only had private collections that wealthy people owned, and then that were really only accessible to white landowning men. And then we had academic libraries that were deeply invested in, that were also kind of like colonial projects of like collecting, from other parts of the world. And then, you know, the kind of the idea of educating people kind of during the like before the rise of the Industrial Revolution, when farmers needed to have access to knowledge, that really became the impetus for the public library movement, where books needed to be made available to farmers, like almanacs and these kinds of things, so that they could better farm. So there's different uneven investments and histories that are not that were not concurrent. So I think that's part of the reason that you see like much better libraries, and those are also contained and constrained, not unlike the early libraries, to people who are credentialed to be in the university, a student, faculty, staff member. And even then that gets graded, because even only professors can get access to certain collections, like special collections, rare books and things. Okay, so there of course has been, I think, like a radical librarianship movement in the United States to democratize libraries and make them more accessible. And at the same time, I would say there's been a huge threat to defunding libraries around the country. I mean, this has been a huge issue. And as libraries also, I mean, they have all these same issues of like uneven, unfair representation in their collections too. I mean, even if we went back to libraries and we didn't have Google, we still have problems in libraries, the kind you're talking about, and also the kind of uneven investments in certain points of view. To some libraries are very like small, if non-existent ethnic studies collections, right? Or books that represent the broader community.
I guess I'm thinking in a taking something national, couldn't this all be put together and put it online, just like Google or any of these other search engines, but it's a public entity, and you would have all the access that you would have.
We have the Digital Public Library of America. I don't know if it, DPLA. So DPLA it's the Digital Public Library of America. We have WorldCat, and those are two big kind of public efforts. WorldCat, what it does is it helps you, if you're looking, use it like a library interface, like a search interface, and it will tell you every library near you that has something in its collection and how to get it. So there is definitely coordination that has happened between libraries and librarians around the country. I don't think the aspiration though is to like replace Google. I don't think their aspirations are to do that, but they are to use a massive, extensive interlibrary loan programs, so that if your library doesn't have it, you can borrow it from UCLA's library or from LA Public Library. So they're definitely, I mean, those exist. They're not beautiful and polished like Google, but they definitely exist. They definitely exist. I know.
I'm going to pass the mic in just 1 second. I just want to make 2 quick comments. One, I just thought you all should know for this conversation local, which is the founder of CASA Pitzer, of this community-based research program. One of she's my mentor, Rose Ways. One of her parting gifts to pharmacologists before she left academia was to make the Honolulu Library accessible to all the public. So our library of pharmacologists, which is a very prestigious library for 7 colleges, used to be private until just 2 years ago. So that's a really cool way to like actively like, and it was a huge fight just to get the open to the people in the community in which it makes sense. Right. So that's one big note. The other thing, in the time we have, you said something the other night at dinner that really touched me in a great way, and I wanted them to hear it as well. You touched on this already a little bit, but we were talking about oppression and discrimination, and we were all getting depressed, and someone turned to you and said, okay, genius, what's the solution? And you said, paradigm shift. And we are in someone else's imagination, and it's been done before. But that's in some ways very little to do with tech, and but very much to do with us as a society. And I thought if you could just share a little bit about that, because I think that's also what we're trying to do here is work on a very grassroots level, small social justice, scrappy organizations to make changes. And sometimes it feels very local and small. Yes, but it's really important.
It's really important because every change in our society has been local and small. and then those local and small are linked up, and it feels big and national and international. Every struggle around any civil rights law, any change in human rights intervention has happened because something has happened somewhere. And those things, they might happen to someone in your family or to you or to me or to us. And we organize and galvanize around it. So we were talking at dinner, and let me just say, it's a lot of pressure for someone to declare you a genius. And then everyone's like, okay,
Tell us.
show us the answer. And I'm like, I don't know. I was here for dinner. Okay, so that happened. It's fun though. Don't want it to not happen. Okay, so all right. In seriousness, okay. I think one of the things we're talking about was like, how do we intervene? Like what needs to happen? And I think the examples I was giving in our conversation, I said something to the effect of, if I pulled a cigarette out of my bag, right, and just lit it up and just started smoking it while we're talking here, giving a lecture, that would feel really strange to most of you. Okay. And yet, probably the day I was born, the doctor had a cigarette hanging from his mouth and caught me. And then I'm sure my mom chain smoked 2,000 cigarettes from her hospital bed right after giving birth. There's no question whatsoever. Now that seems really hard to imagine in this day and age for most of my students. They're just like, no way. And I'm like, yeah, way, that was like literally just until like 5 minutes ago that was happening. So what caused the paradigm shift around smoking? Because smoking was sold to the public as a product that makes you sexy, makes you skinny, makes you a real man, curbs your appetite, cool, makes you cool, 100%. Say it again. Doctors recommend it. 3 out of 4 doctors recommended smoke Marlboro or Camel. Get a smoking filter on it and get like in a Virginia Slims. Now you're like throwing back to the golden age of Hollywood, right? I mean, I know all the things. Okay. And there were massive research centers at big universities all over the country that were funded by Big Tobacco, where studies came out to prove that cigarettes can't kill you and don't make you sick and are not the cause of cancer, all of the things. And then we had a paradigm shift around it. And part of that came from a massive class action lawsuit against the tobacco industry. The tobacco industry had to fund billions of dollars to this day into anti-smoking education campaigns. We have something called the Truth Campaign, and they are the organization that does public service announcements and all the cool things, and don't smoke, and smoking is trash, and all the things, and all the studies and research. And now we don't live under the paradigm of thinking that smoking is amazing and great for us. In our ancestors' era, in the era of Big Cotton, people got up every day with their enslaved African peoples who were beaten, whipped, lynched, harmed, destroyed physically right in front of them and their children's eyes. And then they went in the house and made pancakes. And then they got somebody ready for school and they went off to school and worked. And that kind of intimate violence happening right there. And I know many of us may be familiar with like intimate experiences of violence, right? So I apologize because I'm not trying to harm us, but I want us to remember that people experience those things and then they go on about their daily lives. And that was the era for 200 years of enslavement of African people in this country. And it was a small handful of people who were abolitionists who constantly pulled at the immorality of the institution. And you have to remember during the paradigm, under the paradigm of big tobacco and the period of enslavement, the arguments people made were like this: we can't do away with slavery. The whole economy is predicated upon it. It's everywhere. We depend upon it. How would we go to school without it? How would our households run? How would our businesses run? How would our economy run? It's so overwhelming, I don't even know where to start. How do I personally, individually resist this institution that's so barbaric and so like hideous and inhumane, and yet felt so totalizing? And we had a paradigm shift. Okay, so I invoke those because we want to remember we might be the people. It just might be us. We might be the abolitionists in the tech sector. We don't know, you know, I mean, if you talk to your parents, let's say your grandparents, except for, you know, our grandparents might not be around anymore, but let's just say you talk to the generation, like the oldest baby boomers you can find. Those who worked in civil rights, okay, they'll tell you it was not everybody that was out on the front line with Dr. King. It's not everybody who was organizing with Malcolm X. It was not everybody who was backing the women organizers who organized and led the whole civil rights movement and didn't get credit. It wasn't everybody that was visible and out on the streets. It was somebody who was making sandwiches too for them, for when freedom riders came through their community. Somebody made their couch available for people to sleep on. There's like millions of acts that lead up to and create a paradigm shift. Okay, so that's the invitation, I think, for us, is what is our goal is shifting the paradigm, rather than saying like tech is everywhere, it's ubiquitous, there's nothing we can do. It's like the whole economy is based on it.
Yeah.
Roger, Aaron, had questions? You just have the mic. You keep passing it down.
One thing I just want to, while this hand pass, we talked about before was we brought up cigarettes. I don't know if you've seen the documentary, The Century of the Self, online, but it's
Yes.
about how psychologists were brought in specifically to start to link advertisements to emotional aspirations. And they gave cigarettes, they wanted more women to smoke, so they gave the suffragettes, these white suffragettes, cigarettes. And they filled them lighting up as they were like marching, right? So like it was a very, very deliberate coupling of these things, right? Moving us from being citizens to consumers, right? And that's a lot of the paradigm shift is like, how do we stop being consumers? Because so many of the solutions that you're talking about require people to not value capital. We're like this biodiversity, people to break down monopolies means there has to be a paradigm shift where profit is the biggest value, right? And this like myth of neoliberalism that the markets will balance out, right? That they'll balance themselves out. And so that, you know, that's really exciting to me, right? Like, what does that feel like? What does that look like? And that it's been done before.
Yeah.
It's so exciting.
I mean, listen, to me, it's like I think about this conversation, and it's not just the tech. I think to myself, how is it that at UCLA, 40% of our students are food insecure? 40% of our students are food insecure. That means they aren't guaranteed eating every day. And during the pandemic, when people were at the height of their crisis, which I think people are still at a high level of crisis, the university gave everybody Slack. Kill me. I mean, like the last thing I want is some more software, especially Slack. It's just for me, I can't do one more thing. Do we need one more software license and rollout when we have these other kinds of things that to me feel so much more pressing? So it's like, it's not just like the tech things that we should be concerned about. And of course, we know that the tobacco executives went to go work for big tech. And if you watch The Social Dilemma, you'll see there's like, you know, it's just full of these old tobacco executives who now work for all the big companies and are their lobbyists. But you also have to put in the system, like, why do we choose to upgrade all of this when what we need to do is redirect resources to that? Why do we let a company, you know, these companies not pay taxes which undermines our ability to have affordable housing. Like, what is the relationship between, why did the tech sector make the most money during the time of COVID-19 and our public health system was falling apart? The not paying taxes, the offshoring their profits to, other countries, all of these kinds of things to bleed the public dry and break the kinds of institutions and networks of care that we need to institutionalize. And then we turn around and we say, well, maybe there's an app for that. I mean, what? Like, it's like ludicrous. So this is the kinds of ways we have to keep people critical.
Yeah, it's almost our time, so I think we might have time for one more.
Sorry.
Yeah. Can we go to somebody who maybe hasn't spoken yet? I saw Aaron's hand up. Do you mind? And then we'll go back. Yeah. Just to be equitable. Maybe we'll have time for both.
My question is kind of going back to what you brought up a little bit earlier, and also that brought up in the discussion we're having in class before you arrived. Thinking about when we were talking about libraries, and even how they can be a useful alternative to internet search engines or people, but then there's still the issues of who gets represented within those like the archives. And a point that Anton had made was like doing research on like agricultural pedagogy for this class and realizing that there's a lot of like indigenous knowledge that does not get put into these databases that were directed to use for research, and so and kind of grappling with that, and also adding on to that, I think something that I have personally felt, and I think a lot of people have similar experiences, like there are a ton of problems with social media and shadow banning and the way the algorithms manipulate information, but it's also been a unique opportunity for the democratization of knowledge and information share in a way that traditional media outlets have not allowed for and have really controlled the flow of information. And so like trying to grapple with, yes, there are all these terrible things that the internet does. And even these platforms that we're trying to use to make information more accessible are cracking down on that. But then again, there's people, there's knowledge, there's information that isn't being represented. I don't know exactly what the specific question is, but like how do we grapple with who is represented in these places, and then like it's like one avenue that I have seen for more people from more backgrounds, from more perspectives to share beyond what is traditionally like allowed to be shared by like the powers that be.
Great.
Can I ask that we let Rob ask the question and see if there's any similarity in how you
Yes,
speak
that's
to
what I
both of them?
was just, yeah,
With the last 5 minutes.
great.
Yeah, hi, my name's Rob. Thank you so much for coming today. So we talked about this way back in the beginning about how there are whistleblowers in the tech industry that basically like admitted that they knew the harm of what they were doing, and I guess my question was like, did they have the intent of causing that harm, or did they just know that that was that the impact of what they were doing was causing that harm? And then the other question I have is about, or I'll just leave it there because of our time.
Okay, great. All right, so quickly, I think there have been whistleblowers and former employees who have come out of an experience in their jobs that have transformed them by process of doing that work, and then realizations happen. So a lot of good people work in a lot of companies they, organizations, corporations are organized in ways that really keep people working at a granular level on just their one little tiny thing, such that it's very difficult to link up what your whole project is about or what you're really doing. And that's one of the ways that you can get labor out of people in ways that they might morally object to. And once people make those connections, they will either conscientiously object, like the Microsoft workers who walked out and said they didn't want, and Google workers who walked out who didn't want their labor working in service of the Department of Defense. They didn't want to use their skills to make autonomous weapons that were going to kill people. So, there are people who are able to link up and understand eventually what their work is doing. And plenty of people who don't care because they need to secure the bag to take care of their families, and they just are like, I can't make those moral decisions on behalf of the company. I need a salary because I have to pay rent. So, and I don't actually know shade. We should design a world so that people don't have to work against their conscience to live. So that's another thing to put into the new paradigms we want. I think, there is this idea that the internet has democratized us more and made knowledge and information more accessible. And there's no denying that. That's absolutely true. I will say though, we should not have a simplistic analysis of thinking like before the internet, we didn't know anything and big media controlled everything. Because we actually had, for example, hundreds of thousands of newspapers in this country, and people had a lot of local control and say and input and deliberation about what happened in their local community. And now people have local newspapers that are like from Sinclair or these kind of right-wing media operations that just funnel down to like some rural community that are like propaganda papers. So I would argue that we could slice that a lot of different ways, and that the struggles over knowledge and information happen in different forms, and not unlike the search for the quest for like indigenous knowledge that doesn't get encoded, or oral traditions that are not text-based. People also, in my non-scientific analysis on this one, engaged with the machine and might be able to read more and do more, but this space for public gathering and public deliberation and public debate and arguing, like as Gen Xers, we got in a room like this after class at like 6, 7 o'clock at night and like battled it out, people from Black Student Union and Gay Alliance, Women's Alliance, and like whatever the organizations were called in the 90s and the 80s. And we hashed out our politics and we argued, and then we worked strategically on local things we were going to work on our college campus. And that was not a campaign where the net effect was like just sitting around and doing this. Okay. So I'm just saying there are other things gained, there are things lost. And there's transfer of knowledge and wisdom from other older activists and professors and people who did that work and were able to do that work with us. It was very deep and meaningful. That was different than getting to scroll like, the wokery online. It's just a different experience. It's a different thing. And I would say losing the ability to gather and be together and hash out our politics and be clear about what they are, and then organize and work on something is really, that's part of the project of commodifying our progressive politics and then turning it into memes and then, products on the internet. It's worth thinking about. You're welcome. This was a good time. I shouldn't have worn a sweater because I didn't know it was so hot out there, but I'm so grateful. Thank you for inviting me
Thank you
and for introducing me to your brilliant students. I'm really so grateful to meet you all. I hope you stay in touch.
Thank
You
you
guys
so
all
much.
give it up.
Thank you so much for coming and making the trek. We have some comments here, people thanking you.
Thank you.
And most people thought it ended at noon, so they did
Oh.
not. But my sister Christine was on for a minute. Thank you
Thanks,
so
everyone.
much.
Thank you, everyone.